Welcome back to the Wrestling Roundtable, and we're going to move on to a very interesting topic. It's going to take some thinking outside the box, including a lot of factors, and it will, I believe, tie into a topic we had talked about before, which is some of the most important events in wrestling history. This will kind of center around it, but it's kind of the time machine topic in a way. The Homer Simpson going back, stepping on a bug, and it changes everything sort of thing. So to start off with the first scenario, what if Hulk Hogan had never left Verne Gagne's AWA in 1983?
Bob Backlund would be very happy.
We wouldn't be here, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
You'd be filming just the blank wall. That's about it. We wouldn't be here. Who knows what would happen?
Yeah, that would be just, we would have never had pay-per-view.
That's a big one.
But do you think,
WrestleMania, no wrestling booms, no Austin, no Rock, no Attitude.
Okay,
but do you think that
No
no
Monday
should have
Night
been
Wars.
brought out, or would have focused someone on Macho Man?
What would have happened at WWF? Would they have still done WrestleMania? Would they have been able to? Would they have been would somebody else have to have been chosen? Would Savage or somebody have stepped up to become that megastar?
Yeah, like in the alternate edited video, we see Mr. T and Macho Man.
Mr. T and Andre.
But the other thing is, we all know why Hogan left the AWA is because Verne Gagne was not capitalizing on his Rocky III fame, and he was getting so ridiculously over in AWA. When you see that fight of him and Bockwinkel, where they screwed him over the last time, and the house lights came up, arena full of pissed off fucking people.
Yeah.
So you can't blame Hogan for leaving. But if he had Sting, that kind of implies that Gagne would either have to have gotten really smart, really quick, or continued fucking up like he was.
Well, he would also, let's say he stayed and made all the money that he made in WWF for AWA. Do you realize they would have had the Road Warriors there and Michaels there?
Right.
And
Hennig.
like with Hogan as their
But
top
would they
guy.
have the McMahon mentality to bring that, make wrestling such a monster as it was?
Mhm.
That's the big question.
Or they could have been a more viable third brand. But speaking of brands and other companies and stuff, we're going to move on to a big one. 1996, Bret Hart, after he lost to Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 12, his contract was up, and he was starting to debate whether he was going to leave because Bischoff was throwing him a lot of money, or stay loyal to McMahon. And of course, McMahon came up with that ridiculous 20-year contract that he went back on. But Bischoff wanted to bring him in as part of the hot new NWO angle before it was even called NWO. And Bret Hart, supposedly, was originally going to be the third man at Bash at the Beach. Some people say Sting or whoever. But can you imagine if it was Bret Hart?
I would say that it would have had no effect, short term at the most, because that needed Hulk Hogan's heel turn to get over. And Bret Hart, Scott Hall, and Kevin Nash have absolutely no chemistry.
I think it would have affected WWF more than WCW.
No chemistry. They would have never won for that many weeks. Because WWF would have found some other way to get people back interested. Because it would have just been another in a long line of WWF guys showing up in WCW.
And you'd have to imagine that Hogan would have been in the Sting role then. He would have inserted himself there.
Well, that's how he got involved in the first place. He
Yeah,
inserted himself.
he would have inserted himself
Oh my
there.
God.
And, could you really imagine that, that long, drawn-out, Hogan being like the Crow type character? Like,
And,
how ridiculous that drawn out.
I think for a Bret Hart heel turn, his face for a number of years, I think that would have been
Not in another
a
promotion.
weak, it would have been a weak heel turn.
Oh,
The
come
fans
on.
would have taken to him way too quickly.
You know better than anybody how vital the Hogan turning heel element was to that
Yeah.
angle. I think it was more important than the WWF invading part of that angle. Because everybody that night was like, there's no way
It
Hogan's
took
going to
that
turn.
angle and blew it through the roof.
Oh, God.
Blew it through the roof. And without Bret, there would have been no Austin. He wouldn't have,
You don't
he
know
built
that.
up.
He could have feuded with somebody
I
else.
agree with
And
that.
it wouldn't have. It wouldn't
He
have
was-
He was a
been-
catalyst.
Not
He
least,
would not have-
he wouldn't have been a face as soon as he was.
You would not have had the
as big as he was.
McMahon character, though. You can
Yeah,
say you may
you
have had Austin, but you would not have had Mr.
You
McMahon.
probably wouldn't have had DX. There wouldn't have been no DX because with Bret Hart coming with his family values and all his loyalty, and Michaels that completely anti Bret Hart. Bret Hart gave him that deal for DX, and that's how that.
Hogan is
idea
the
came up.
exception to every rule.
And now, of course, you're absolutely right that Hogan is the X
And that's the
factor
end.
that put them over the top. That's what everyone heard. Hogan's a bad guy. They turned over, and we know the rest. However, the fact that Hall and Nash were showing up by themselves, alone, aside from Hogan, was pretty big at the time. And Bret Hart being that he was just WWF champion being in that group would have just, it certainly would have had the impact Hogan would have outside the wrestling bubble. But inside the wrestling world, it would have been big in and of itself. But let's look at it from a different point of view outside of just names. Bret Hart, especially when he was functional, was a much better wrestler, worker than Hogan was. He was the more technical, have great matches style wrestler. And having that as the leader at the NWO is the complete opposite of Hogan winning the belt in horrible matches by cheating and showing up once a year if we're lucky.
That, though, as part of that storyline.
That's also, Bret Hart's style was probably more of a WCW style. Would the fans have turned on him? Or when he walked through the door, would the fans have just gone nuts and just, you know...
They would have accepted him. I just don't think
I don't
Bret
think
was
would have
They would have just loved it. They would have loved
Bret-
Bret Hart coming in, I think.
Bret tied his wagon to WWF. He was so associated, but only in the context of WWF. Bret Hart's character was that he was the bread and butter WWF guy. And if he leaves, and this happened when he went to WCW, that whole element of his character was stripped. And he could never rebuild that association that he had. You know what I mean? That was part of what made Bret Hart a star. Hogan didn't need that. He was just Hulk Hogan, bigger than life, you know? Bret needed to be the guy in the WWF, the top star, the champion, the consummate, always do right by the fans, do the right thing for the company, do the job, well, you know, kayfabe aside. And in kayfabe, he was our champion. We're so proud of Bret, the excellence of execution. When we went to WCW, that whole part was gone. Hall and Nash were still the cool guys, the young hip guys. Hogan was still...
I think they would overshadow Bret Hart.
Something was always missing with Bret, and not until recently when I thought about it in WCW, it was that he wasn't in WWF. I know that sounds a little weird, but that's what was missing from his character in WCW.
We did see how great he was as a heel in '97 with WWF.
But that was also with the anti-American heel. He was very good at that in that role, but as a straight bad guy, he wasn't that great in WWF.
Yeah, well, you know what made his bad guy work in WWF too was that his bad guy personality wasn't just that he was anti-American. It was that he was anti-WWF majority fans. Now, you can't do that in WCW because what is he protesting against? I don't think he ever had enough elements to his character to stay in WCW.
Well, it's an interesting thing to consider. But one last thing I'd like to say is I hate to see what the Clique would do with the WWF after he left. Anyway, one other real quick one. What if Austin hadn't broke his neck in '97? Now, it sounds odd, but here's the thing to consider. Because he broke his neck, and when he came back, hadn't had the surgery yet, the main event style of WWF completely changed. And it became catered to his limitations, where every general pay-per-view main event became punch, kick, finisher, ball through the crowd, table spot, all the usual stuff that they've never completely broken away from. Now, sometimes it was good, you know, the Foley matches were great and everything, but it just really took away from the Austin that we knew, and the Austin that came back after the neck surgery.
And that's part of it too, the Austin that came back. Part of the McMahon storyline was that McMahon was keeping...
Wouldn't let him wrestle.
Wouldn't let him wrestle, so the fans really wanted to see Austin wrestle, so I think that added to it.
We're going to be coming back and talking about some more what-ifs when we come back. More Wrestling Roundtable.